Good evening, everyone. I wish it were a good evening. We are here not because we want to, but because we have to. I want to welcome everyone to Park Avenue Synagogue, to a sanctuary filled with people with heavy hearts and the weight of our world upon us, and questions for which there are no answers. I want to welcome all those who are online, who are with us from afar. This evening, as we do every evening, we will pray. We'll come together as a community to be inspired this week in a moment of darkness, and to feel the presence of each other. As a Shiva house teaches, even when we have nothing to say, simply being together with community gives us strength, that we are not alone. Last time many of us were here, we were here on Yom Kippur, and we engaged in a dialogue with Dr. Richard Haass, who throughout the decades of his career has brought wisdom and analysis to so many hot spots in the world and moments of crises. And both in friendship, Dr. Haass, but also with a heavy heart, we welcome you back to the Bima, perhaps not because you bear answers, but because we seek to find the vocabulary, the words, as the title of this program is, to make sense of the senseless. Dr. Haass is a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations, president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also senior counselor with Centerview Partners, an international investment banking advisory firm. He previously served as CFR's president for some 20 years in the State Department under Presidents George Bush and Ronald Reagan, at the White House under George H.W. Bush, and at the Pentagon under Jimmy Carter. He was the U.S. envoy to the Cyprus negotiations and the Northern Ireland peace process, and after 9/11 was a U.S. coordinator for the future of Afghanistan. Dr. Haass is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy, 1 book on management, and 1 on American democracy. His latest book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, was recently published in 2023 and has become a bestseller. The author of a weekly newsletter, Home and Away, available on Substack, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin. He's a Rhodes Scholar, the master and doctorate from Oxford, and a number of honorary degrees. He's a recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award, the Presidential Citizens Medal, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. Dr. Haass was born in Brooklyn and grew up on Long Island and lives here in New York City with his wife.
You left out the most important thing, and a proud member of Park Avenue.
A proud member of Park Avenue Synagogue. You know, it's to see you here on a Friday night is a familiar experience, a weekly experience, and we call on you now and you know, to make one lighthearted remark in this very dark moment. Unlike Yom Kippur, you're allowed to drink water during this dialogue. Dr. Haass, when we met, I don't know what it was, less than a month ago, we talked about a lot: Ukraine, Russia, China, the environment. We talked about the Saudi peace plan. We talked about everything, but we didn't talk about this possibility. And so how would you situate what has transpired, the horrors that have transpired? And I just want everyone to know, we will be speaking to the heart as the evening progresses. We're seeking wisdom and the head at this moment in time. I'm not unaware of the pain in the room. But Dr. Haass, not as a pastor, but to understand what's happened, how can we situate the events of last week in a broader arc?
It's an important question because in some ways the surprise element of all this suggests that others weren't looking for it as well. And it's a painful, costly reminder that just because we're not focused on something, not paying attention to it, not predicting it, doesn't mean others with very different agendas are not, and history is filled with surprise. This wasn't the first such surprise attack, but I think when we were looking at the Middle East, the United States approaches this part of the world with some exhaustion after Iraq and so forth. For good reason, we've been focused on Ukraine and Russia's aggression, obviously concerned about China, worried about climate change, worried about things domestic. So the inbox was pretty full. And when one looked at the Middle East, the traditional, what we used to call the peace process, Rabbi, the principal dynamic was between Israel and neighboring countries, and hope that maybe there'd be a breakthrough with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was not an unrealistic hope. And the Palestinian issue, there was no sense of optimism. There was nothing to work with. It's really gone on the diplomatic back burner, but the assumption was that it could safely sit there. And one of the things that I've learned time and time again, and it's sad that I have to learn it so often, is that assumptions are dangerous things. And one of the things we all need to do is question them, almost do an audit on whether you would do it in the personal life, that's your agenda. But in what I would call political or economic life, to every once in a while, like, what are the assumptions I'm making about all the things I'm focusing on or not, and might they be wrong? Or what would be the consequences if they were wrong? And I think here we just all made this assumption that if it was stable, and it's almost like we used to say about the Middle East, it was a bicycle, that if it wasn't moving forward, it would fall off. And I think we forgot that. And say one other thing, so much of the thinking about the Middle East was that peacemaking could be done from the outside in, top down, dealing with governments, and you could safely park this problem. And what we learned is that it could not be safely parked.
Okay, thank you. Part of my goal for this hour that we have together, there are many high school students in the room. This is a program, unlike, say, Yom Kippur afternoon, that we're also looking to level set the conversation. So I want to take a step back before we take a step forward. Help us understand the dynamic of Hamas vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. Are they representing all of the Gazan population? How do we understand this terrorist attack in terms of the demography of Gaza writ large? I know that Rabbi Kaufman prepared some maps that people can look at. Yeah. But as an organization, Islamist organization, how do we understand the history of Hamas and its role in Gazan society today?
So Gaza is one of the several domains where you have a significant Palestinian population, in this case in the vicinity of 2 million. Gaza was under Egyptian supervision, if you will, until the 1967 war. And with the Israeli victory in the 1964, as you all know, came additional territory. We mainly talk about Jerusalem and the West Bank, parts of the Golan Heights, but the other part was Gaza. And when Israel in the late 1970s, after the 73 war, when Israel returned territory to Egypt, it was in the Sinai. And quite honestly, Egypt had no interest in getting Gaza back. So this was part of the areas where Palestinians live. And it used to be, we always talked about it, the West Bank and Gaza. It was a phrase that the territories, occupied territories and so forth, were what the Israelis called Judea and Samaria in terms of the West Bank. And then they'd say, and Gaza. It was a separate entity. It was an area of considerable turbulence, often terrorism coming out of it. Indeed, it led the Israelis various times for incursions. The Israelis went in very big in the early 2000s, ultimately left in 2005. Essentially, the cost of staying in Gaza was high. And the Israelis did something that is quite interesting. They left it unilaterally. They left it without an understanding as to exactly what would be the political or the arrangements. The one message was, though, just because we're leaving, don't think we couldn't come back or do something if once again you pose a threat to the state and its occupants. And what happened then, I won't make a long story long, I'll try to make it short, is there were elections in the West Bank and Gaza, separate elections, and Hamas won, much to the surprise of the United States government. This was during George W. Bush's presidency. And it's a separate conversation, but to me it was a real lesson. I was not in favor of it because I thought it's not enough to have free and fair elections on election day. Democracy is not simply, it's about elections, yes, but you need to set the table, and I was worried that in Gaza the table wasn't set. And Hamas had built up a lot of support among the people because it's more than a terrorist organization, to give it its due. It does areas in the economy, in the society, in politics. It's a multifaceted phenomenon. By the way, it's an acronym, Hamas, just to mention it, the Islamic Resistance Movement. So shocked the Americans and much of the world that it won, and it's governed Gaza, not the West Bank, but Gaza ever since. There haven't been elections since. And it's imposed, shall we say, a significant degree of control that is illiberal to its core. And periodically, there would be skirmishes or friction between Israel and Hamas, but mainly kept under a degree of control. Indeed, most of the Israeli focus, interestingly enough, was about the West Bank. That was seen as the heart of the Palestinian world. When people talked about the Israeli-Palestinian problem, Gaza was kind of shunted off to the side, in part because, one, it was geographically separate, partially also because the constitution of Hamas was such that there was no grounds for peacemaking. It rejected the Jewish state, rejected Israel. So whereas the Palestinians and the West Bank were potential partners, even though time and time again they proved to be disappointing when the peace was being negotiated at Camp David or the Y Plantation or wherever, Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza were something separate. They were not part of that dynamic, so it was parked, and it was just seen as a manageable problem, not potentially solved, but it would just be parked or sitting there. And again, I think people to some extent took their eye off the ball. What Israel did was various times did operations against it, built all sorts of physical barriers on the Israeli side of the border, had a Gaza division in the IDF. But again, I think essentially diplomatically was focused on relations with Arab states. They made better partners. And to the extent it was focused on Palestinians, far more on the slightly larger Palestinian community living in the West Bank. That was seen as the only potential partner, as disappointing or as problematic as it was. And what I think, again, this was a reminder, is that you can ignore things at your peril. Indeed, for Hamas, maybe I apologize, I'm getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. I think part of what this is about, there's several theories as to why what happened. One of the theories is they did this at Iranian behest to derail the movement towards a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, in part because Iran wanted to derail a closer U.S.-Saudi relationship with a security agreement with a nuclear dimension. The other thing, though, I think had more to do with Hamas, which this is Hamas's way. It's almost, and I don't mean to be glib, almost a form of station identification. And this is the way of Hamas saying, we're still here, and by the way, unlike that weak, corrupt, old, feckless Palestinian authority that's sitting in the West Bank, we are the one Palestinian organization that is willing and able to take the fight to Israel. And I think this was Hamas's, a lot of this, I don't know to what extent, it's not clear the intelligence, to what extent Iran pushed them, but I think they were very happy to be pushed if they were pushed, because this is their way of essentially competing for place. And it was a message to the Israelis, a message to the Palestinians of the West Bank, and a message to Arab governments. You cannot ignore us. We still have the ability and the will to act, and we can make some claims on the Arab world. Sorry to go on so long.
No, that's why we're here. That's why we're here. Thank you very much. So we can't necessarily assume, because just you sort of queued up the next question regarding the the horrors of last week in terms of being prompted by, encouraged by, funded by, whether it's Iranians, whether it's somehow in coordination with Hezbollah or other terrorist actors, or it could have just been a unilateral action and not just not coordinated, but almost, as you're suggesting, not in defiance, but independent of anyone else. And that was the whole point of it.
Up to a point. I find that Iran clearly has what I would call a strategic or structural relationship with Hamas. Principal backer, supporter, trainer, funder.
Can I just ask, like, how does that, and maybe this you can incorporate this into your answer, how does that happen? Because there's a blockade around Gaza. You know, I wonder, like, all these rockets that are being shot at, I understand how they get into Lebanon, but how does Iran fund, arm, right, the rockets, the bullets, the RPGs, everything? Is that through the Egyptian border?
Lots of smuggling. Yeah, lots of smuggling. That's the principal way, based on what I remember from when I used to focus on this on a regular basis. But yeah, smuggling's a big deal. There's also dual-use things that can get into Gaza, and we see. I don't know if you've noticed, like some of the things going on in Ukraine or with Russia, that you ship quote-unquote civilian things. Russia is able to get in the Middle East all sorts of civilian electronics. And then they take them, and out of those, among other things, become drones and other systems. So there's and bombs and so forth. So there's ways of taking things which are not explicitly military and militarizing or weaponizing them. So there's a bit of that as but I would think smuggling and domestic production. A lot of the know-how now is pretty widespread, and so a lot of these things can be produced internally produced from within. I find it hard to imagine. Actually, I'll be honest, I find it impossible to imagine that Iran was not knowing of this. The idea that Hamas would do something independently of its patron, I just don't see it. Now, it could have been that Iran was involved, shall we say, with strategic support of Hamas, rather than involved in the tactical timing or certain aspects of it, and that might have even been. It's ironic, in the intelligence business, you often talk about plausible deniability. You try to keep a little bit of distance between yourself. It might be that Iran was trying to do that in order to avoid certain types of retribution. But I find it, I just don't see that Hamas could or would have done this. Particularly also, this was not something that was cooked up 10 days ago. My guess is this was more likely months or years in the making.
Right, that's a fly in the ointment of the Saudi idea, because
yes, sir.
If this was years in the making.
Might have had something to do with the timing of it, that or the October 73 anniversary. That's why I am closest to the idea that this is consistent with Hamas's DNA, that this is their cruel, misguided, use whatever adjective, hateful way of saying, we are willing and able to cause great harm if our agenda is not met. So that's why I would put the emphasis there, and I think Iran and others would be happy about some of the secondary, if you will, repercussions of this.
Right. The next question I'm very wary of asking, because I know the fault lines of this question.
But you're going to ask it all.
But I'm going to ask it anyway, and I would ask the forgiveness of the community, because I myself am searching for the words. The sheer barbarism of what we've seen, babies, rape, families tied together, burnt alive, things that are horrific beyond words, that there are no words for, that reveal the face of evil. And just as someone who's studied military history, who's aware of Geneva, who knows sort of the context by which warfare takes place against other armies, civilian populations, and otherwise, is it as simple as just we've seen the face of evil, or is there any other scaffolding to understand the horrors of the past week?
It's dangerous to think out loud, but let me think out loud. I think part of it is, yes, we've seen the face of evil, and the idea that whether people were ordered to do that or simply took it upon themselves, the idea that they could actually do that is beyond the understanding or comprehension, or whatever word one wants to use, of I'll speak for myself. My guess is, though, there is a second layer, because it was too widespread. I mean, think about what they did. There are certain parts of this that were not accidental. One was the taking of hostages, and I think two reasons to that. One was to have a bargaining chip to get back Hamas operatives that were in Israeli prisons and so forth. The other was possibly to use as shields to deter Israeli military action. So that was calculated. Could the brutality and the rest, I've only got two explanations for it, and I'm not confident of either. One is just, like, this is not a professional military. These are not people, who could care two figs about the laws of war. And who knows where some of these people were recruited from. And this could just be, these are people in some cases who were raised on hatred of Jews. That's a big part of the Hamas agenda. So here was a chance to carry it out. They had been fed, this is the rhetoric, this is the motivation. So part of it is...
Well, if you don't believe that the victim is human, then it's not murder.
And there might have also been, I mean, then we're into sort of Holocaust-like things. This is a way to get rid of Jews. Not inconceivable that some would have thought that. And also to intimidate. This is a way that I expect there were some people in Hamas who were saying this is a way to shake confidence in the Jewish state and for the Jewish state. So there might have been a veneer, if you will, of a twisted logic to it, but it was too prevalent to have just been happenstance.
Right. I'm going to go a bit out of order because we're talking about the ideology and nature of Hamas. Today, it is not without note that there's been a day of rage that has been announced. The New York's community, being the largest Jewish population outside of the state of Israel, this distinction between Zionists and Jews and, frankly, Americans or anyone from the West, the idea that we're all on our heels right now, we're all taking security precautions. Are we to believe that the arms of Hamas, the ideology of Hamas, I mean, they don't care if you're for or against judicial reform, right? They are, a good Jew is a dead Jew.
And the only Israel they want is one that doesn't exist. This is, shall we say, existential.
Yeah. And so the ripple effect of this moment for the American Jewish community and for the political landscape here, there seems to be a next stage of this playing out in our own fears of people in this room and watching us online.
Sure, and it's warranted. Look, what happened was horrific, but then some of the reaction here, I mean, it's, how could you not be, I don't know, maybe it's not shock, but how could you not be worried about it? The kind of what I call the whataboutism, the relativism about it, or worse yet, those who were saying that Israel's responsible for this, the idea of singling out Israel somehow, bringing this about, knowing nothing about what Israel has done over the years, various diplomatic offers that were made that were rejected by Palestinians, overlooking the savagery of what was done, overlooking the nature of Hamas rule, and so forth. I mean, I felt that so much of this is happening on universities, and if I were a university administrator, I'd be saying, what are we not teaching here? How is it that so many of our students could have such, not just be absolute in their views, but have views that are so ill-founded. What is it we are not doing? Why are we failing? I mean, there ought to be a teach-in. University administrators ought to be thinking, and it's not just, these are our elite universities. It's at Harvard, it's at Columbia, it's at Pennsylvania, it's at NYU. What is it? Look, people can have legitimate differences about these. I get it. I've had debates on this for 50 years. But the debates have parameters. They have parameters about the ends and the means alike. And the idea that we're having people who have access to the greatest educations in the world at these great institutions are voicing opinions and views outside the parameters of decency? What has gone wrong? What has gone wrong there? And that ought to be, I think, for us. I take that as a warning. It's another piece of warning. Look, again, I talked before about assumptions. It's just a warning. We have to be mindful. And I also think we've got to do a better job. And I can articulate the challenge, Rabbi, more than I can maybe articulate the answers, of how do we push back? How do we give young people the arguments? How do we make sure that those who hold these views are in a distinct minority rather than dominating 20 or 30 organizations on the most elite campuses in America? How do we get on the playing field here? Ideas matter. Give a 10-second aside. I spent a long time at the Council on Foreign Relations. One of our scholars just published a really good book about China, and it's called Sparks, and it's about the fight for history in China and how the government has relentlessly tried to control the writing of history because they understand that history is not simply about the past. History is powerful. It's about the present and the future. He or she who controls history has tremendous power. We ought to take this seriously. We have got to do a better job at competing over the narrative. We can't let these distorted narratives stand because these young people who are 20 years old or 25 years old at these elite institutions going to their law schools or colleges of arts and sciences, in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years, they're going to be powerful people in this society. We have got to take this seriously.
Right. And just so everyone knows, we as a synagogue community for our young people, we've already had a talking session tomorrow afternoon. We're having the teen session Tuesday evenings. We're having Brett Stevens and Rachel Fish to talk about this exact subject. And of course, I see many of you, I know many of you are mobilized exactly on this question of what's happening at our higher institutions, and it's happening in my inbox in our high schools. I don't need to wait till our kids are 20 or 25. I cannot tell you the number of phone calls I've gotten from the children of the parents of the children of our community who are in high schools, public and private, here in New York City. So is a question, and I want to affirm and name that voice because I know many of you are here. We're going to work hard as a community to provide whatever workshops and resources are. One thought is, look, if someone doesn't think Israel has a right to exist, then there's not much you can say to that person. But the people, it's a hearts and minds, if you want to say between the 40-yard lines, between the 20, wherever you is, that there is a band of people who don't know where Israel is on the map, don't have a formulated opinion, but just group Israel as a colonialist oppressor and come up with this sort of they had it coming idea, really out of a position of ignorance. And I think about our kids who are in high school who see that on social media. And that's spit at them in the hallways of school, and they may not have the response, whether that's social media, the hallways, or the playground. And is it? I mean, so it's a real ground game of education you're describing.
I think there's elements that are anti-Semitism, which is a related but different thing. But yeah, I think there is a real educational thing, and we have. I mean, think about it. Jews, one of the things we do at Passover is we educate the next generation. That's a big rationale for the Seder. We don't take it for granted. Okay, let's bring it forward a couple of thousand years. what could we do to better educate, not in the sense what it means to be Jew, but what are the basics of the history of modern Israel, of Zionism. It's not to airbrush it. There's flaws, there's mistakes that have clearly been made along the way, but a totality of the picture. And so people can hold their ground and feel, in an argument, a debate, but also just feel comfortable. Because you get so bombarded with one side of it, just to feel comfortable. So not only that they can push back in a classroom, but they can just feel comfortable with it. And I think that's important, to give people that.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Ross or whoever has the microphones, because I want the questions to come from the community as much. I received some emails. I received one. I'm not going to read it in full, but the question about Israeli response. And I've read some op-eds about this very subject, about Israel's options right now. Sure. And this individual emailed me about his fear of Israel going into Gaza right now for a variety of reasons. Number one, the Israeli soldiers, is this exactly what our enemies want and are expecting us to do? Number two, the tide turning, that Israel will go from being a victim to being an aggressor, and what that will be. And number three, just a spiraling circle of violence. Not that two wrongs make a right, sure, but that at a certain point, right, just turning Gaza into a parking lot is not. So as you look at this in terms of a series of bad options that Israel has right now, I was wondering if you could just sort of give us the range.
Look, the reality of foreign policy in situations like this is there are no good options. So you're always forced to choose among problematic options. And if I had to say there were three broad options, one is to do very little at this point. At the other extreme is to do a full invasion, and there's something in between. I think the problem of doing nothing, or the argument for doing something, is I think it's important that when terrorism happens, terrorism is not cost-free to those doing it. There's an important norm. We went into Afghanistan after 9/11 for just that reason. I think then we overreached in certain ways, obviously, in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the basic idea that we have got to push back against terrorists and those who support them, that's one of the, to the extent there's any order in the world, that's important. So I think I would say there's a strong case for Israel doing something, and Israel deserves our support. I have big doubts about a large-scale invasion for all the reasons you mentioned. Leads to war widening. I think the cost to Israel in terms of soldiers being killed and captured, the potential for war widening. I have real doubts about its ability to succeed if success is defined as eliminating or rooting out Hamas. And even if you were to succeed, what happens the day after you leave? What authority that has legitimacy do you put in this place? So I have fundamental questions about something that's of large. So I've been thinking really hard about, is there a curtain three? And where I come out is I think there is. My thinking has two principal dimensions to it. One is, to the extent you can, go after Hamas. Just try to distinguish as best you can between Hamas and Gaza. Go after those who are doing the killing. That requires really good intelligence. Might mean sometimes attacking them with drones or cruise missiles, other times sending in specific special forces. Okay. That's, in a sense, that's something the United States has some experience with. Israel has some experience. Does it root out Hamas? Does it eliminate it? No, but I don't think that's doable anyhow. But this is a way to conduct an operation that puts them on the defensive and basically diminishes their capability. So that's one thing I would focus on. And you avoid many of the pitfalls of the other. The fact causing real damage to civilians and so forth, and causing real problems with Arab neighbors also potentially. The other thing I do is Israel needs to build up its defense. What happened was woefully inadequate. The physical barriers, people flew over, went under them, went through them. Manning was way too low, readiness was too low. So Israel needs to put into place against Gaza a capability so Hamas either won't be tempted to ever do something like this, or if it did, it would be handily defeated. It needs to eliminate the possibility of anything that looks like this kind of an operation redux. Not just something it can and should do. It's on its own territory. So I would do things. I think there's things that we can do to decrease the chance of Hezbollah, and I think particularly through communicating certain things to Iran and so forth. So, but I think also, I think there could be a prisoner exchange and a hostage exchange. I don't think that's beyond possibility. I think at some point, though, Israel also has to think, once the dust settles, it's not for today, might not be for tomorrow, but for the day after tomorrow, Hamas has ruled itself out forever as a partner. That's never going to happen, never should happen. You don't have a Palestinian partner. But if you're like me, you believe that Israel needs a Palestinian state one day, not as a favor to Palestinians, we can argue about that, but as a favor to itself. I want Israel to be a secure, prosperous, democratic Jewish state. I don't know how to accomplish that without a separate Palestinian entity, because ultimately then it would force Israel to choose between its democraticness and its Jewishness. That is a choice I never want Israel to have to make. Right now, though, you can't make peace when you don't have a partner. So one thing Israel has to think about is, what do we do once the situation is stabilized to embark on a long-term project of how we build a context in which one day we, Israel, would have a partner to work with. And that, to me, is a serious enterprise. Take a long time, something have to be done with the United States, with Arab governments. That's potentially a creative diplomatic effort. It's not the conversation for today, but I do think that in situations like this, and I'm heavily influenced, I'll admit it, by my experience in Northern Ireland and how Britain handled the provisional IRA, that you need a security dimension of sending the signal to terrorists that they can never shoot their way to power. Guns will never fulfill their agenda. But there then has to be an alternative. If not for them, for someone else, that they can realize some legitimate political aspirations peacefully. And that, to me, is the challenge for the United States and Israel, is once this situation stabilizes, how to set that up. I think it goes back to your first question, Rabbi. I don't think Israel can create a security environment for itself and remain a secure, prosperous, Jewish, democratic country with a festering Palestinian problem. I think it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be quick, but I believe that has to be on the agenda.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for some questions. We're looking for vocabulary of how to handle this moment. So if, I like everyone, well, that's not true. I don't like everyone, but I want to hear from everyone. Is that Rachel or Rachel in the middle? And remember, a short statement with a question mark. If you give a speech, I will ask that the mic be taken from you.
It's fine. This is the moment I've been waiting for. So.
Please.
Okay, yes, I asked this question because I'm involved in the arts. Back to your point about maybe Israel's PR problem and educating people on Israel, which I think is missing. But yeah, I ask because I feel like programs like Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm were effective in educating people about Jewish culture, but there isn't really anything in the arts right now educating people about like Zionism and how that relates to being Jewish and Jewish culture. And yeah, I'm wondering if you think there's room for like an arts solution here for mass education.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm from LA. I know a little bit about Hollywood. I think there's definitely, in the long game, right, we're all reacting to a moment of trauma, but I think that the positioning of Israel in the imagination of the American psyche, if all Israel is a sort of conflict area, Fauda, colonialist oppressor, then it's not hard to draw the line from the dots of the latest skirmish and that overarching narrative. And that, I think, is what's been co-opted on our campuses, in our high schools, and otherwise. So I cannot think of something better for you to think about as you take off in your career in entertainment and media, to think about those questions, Rachel. I don't know if you have. Okay, great. Let's take another. Is that Morris there, right there by Rabbi Kaufman? Nice and loud, Morris.
Okay, hi. I have two quick questions, and the first one is very simple. When I read the newspaper this week and I saw it, I said, this is Nazism. That's all. Call them Nazis. Why aren't they being called Nazis? People who exist to kill Jews. That it's not about Israel, it's about killing Jews. That's question number one. Question number two, shouldn't Israel, I know tactically, I know it's difficult, and I'm not saying that I'm a general, that I'm a political leader, I'm not. Shouldn't they announce a strategic objective here? Shouldn't our government announce a strategic objective, which is to eliminate Nazis? You can't say you're for a free Palestine or anything like that. Just eliminate Nazis. Thank you.
Well, again, two things. One, I'm not particularly comfortable with the use of that. There's a lot of baggage there, a lot of specific ideology, a lot of history. Evil can come in many forms without using the same language. We'll come up with a good vocabulary for Hamas, but Nazism was a form of systemic thought that is different. This is plenty evil, but I would be, just my own sense is, you don't want to use words that then you have to defend your choice of the word in the face of this kind of evil. This is evil. This is evil enough. Second of all, to the extent what Hamas does represents twisted ideas, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of defining success as eradication or elimination. You won't. In policy here, we've got to think about ends and means. Sorry to be analytical here. I promised you I'd be careful on this. It's hard. Like, one of the ways I cope with something like this is I fall back on my analytical self. So I don't believe eradicating Hamas is possible, because it's not like it's got a headquarters, or it's not an army with 16 tanks and we can blow up those 16 tanks. That misunderstands the nature of what it is. It's too easily reconstituted. It's too fluid. So we've got to think about, how do we marginalize it? How do we defend ourselves against it? And how do we create an environment where alternative merges that can compete with it and win? And it's an alternative that's prepared to work, in this case, with Israel and with the civilized world. That, to me, is the way to think about the policy challenge. But I get nervous when people set goals that I don't know how to achieve. So if the goal is set as eradicating this, you could throw the kitchen sink at it. And Israel did that before, and then as they learned the hard way after 2005, it doesn't have it's not an enduring success. So again, I think it's really important to come up with means and ends that are in sync. Okay, I see a bunch of hands. Sorry, Rabbi, but you'll get your steps in this way. Lisa. Please, nice and loud.
So what are the prospects for the agreement with the Saudis at this point?
Prospects for the agreement with the Saudis? Excuse me. My own sense is it's on pause or on hold. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia clearly wants this agreement, not because he is committed to the plight of the Palestinians, doing something about the plight of the Palestinians. He's committed to a closer relationship with the United States to push back against Iran. But it's clear that other people in Saudi Arabia have different priorities. And perhaps more important, this is now the Palestinian issue for the time being, and we don't know for how long and exactly in what form, is on the front burner. So my own reading of the situation is the Saudis will proceed cautiously until they see how this plays out. I think it's a very different thing if for a prolonged period, Al Jazeera or someone's putting all sorts of images of what's going on, and there's Palestinian men, women, and children who lose their lives and so forth. I think the Saudis are going to be cautious. Again, but I do think ultimately this will come around because the Iranian threat's not going away. MBS is going to be running Saudi Arabia, I think, for a long time. This situation at some point, I believe, will settle down. And so I think that's why I think it's putting the Saudi normalization on hold. And I think a big question, it gets back to what the Rabbi and I were talking about, whether almost, if you remember, a little bit of history here, when the United Arab Emirates normalized relations with Israel, they introduced certain conditions about Israeli foreign policy towards the Palestinians, about certain areas not being annexed and so forth. My guess is that is how it will go with the Saudis, that they will think about an approach to normalization with the Israelis, that besides whatever they get from the Americans on security and nuclear, they will try to protect themselves politically by requiring that certain conditions be met for the Palestinians. And as a result, I think ultimately we will get to Israeli-Saudi relations. It'll just, the situation has to calm and those conditions will have to be worked out.
Thank you. Yes, in the back, I see a hand there. I'm sorry, I can't see. Yes, ma'am, with the, yes.
Hi there. Prior to last weekend's events, I admittedly have had a pretty just shallow understanding and.
Can you speak a little bit closer to the microphone?
Hi. I guess being someone who I've been, doing a deep dive, as I'm sure many have, on social media and listening to the news, what I maybe ignorantly or naively am struck by are the overwhelming masses of, as we speak, are in Times Square protesting for Palestine right now, and kind of going back to Rabbi Cosgrove's question earlier about the extent to which Hamas does or doesn't represent all Palestinians. I guess I'm just trying to find the empathy that is what I assume in awful living conditions, living under a terrorist regime, and I'm just would love your point of view on why more people outside of our community are having such a hard time isolating and calling Hamas terrorists, is kind of how I feel even coming here just now. I was listening to CNN and they were interviewing a woman and she was talking about the events and said, it didn't sound like Hamas. She sounded like me, she sounded like us. She said it didn't sound like Hamas, what I've been seeing, and was giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I just want to understand why it's so hard to isolate.
Thank you.
Look, it's a good question. It's a vexing question. One is, you began by saying we're going on social media. Part of the problem is, people are going on social media. I mean, it's called social media. It's not called fact-filled media. It's not called serious media. It's social media. And it's not vetted. It's not authenticated. It's not fact-checked. People aren't grounded in a comprehensive way. The educations are selective here. They're politicized for whatever agendas. And like any other political debate, those who have the greatest intensity, who bring to it the greatest intensity, often have disproportionate or outsized voice. So, and I think for most people, they're not particularly aware or involved. I would think, this is a country of 340 million people? Well over 300 million of them probably don't have strong views or even the basic understanding of this. We handed out a map here, couldn't find these places on a map. So, part of it is I don't think this is a big, I think it's a much more selective issue. And again, those who care passionately, one way or another, probably have an outsized voice. It's why people take the positions they do, why they seem to either ignore or forgive, or excuse, that's the word. Why they would excuse certain kinds of behavior, overlook it. I can't answer. That gets into a deep question. That's more the rabbi's department than. I think for a lot of people, it's just easier to go along because most of the intensity in the debate has been critical of Israel. I thought it was interesting, like at Harvard, to look at the initial reaction of the administration and the second one. easier to go along the first time and not particularly push back, and then ultimately people did something a bit stronger or better. But I think most of the debate in recent years has been dominated by those of a certain perspective, and it's a perspective that's quite hostile to Israel, and it's quite incomplete in many cases in its knowledge. And again, this is, it's not that what Israel has done or the United States has done has always been right or smart or perfect, obviously not. But what's missing is a perspective and a balance to the conversation. And the motives, I'm not good at ascribing motives to people in political debates. All I can do is look at what they say and write and do. The question of motives is, I didn't take that course in college.
Okay. Yes, sir. I'll wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Everything you've said is, in my opinion, spot on, especially the education element. When we have 10 seconds to tell somebody why these demonstrators are mistaken and that Israel is doing the right thing, what's our elevator pitch?
Let me try this while you're thinking. The first obligation of every government is to defend its citizens. And if this were to happen here or anywhere, what we've seen this past week, no one would say boo about any sort of response other than the fact that it's a Jewish state.
It's what we did after 9/11. Look, there's not a lot of rules in this world we live in. This might be a long elevator ride. What's going on in Ukraine, countries have the right to defend themselves. We want to live in a world where countries don't acquire territory by force, where they don't invade others. That's why it's so important that Russia not succeed. The other is, gets what the rabbi was saying, there is no place for terrorism in this world, either the terrorists or to give them sanctuary of support. That cannot be allowed. That has to be put, it's that simple. We can argue after that a million policy questions, but if we are going to have anything that approximates order in this world, those rules have to be respected. Without them, there is no chance for justice. This is the prerequisite of all else.
Okay. Just want to ask one last question that we haven't touched on, but has very much been in the news. The American response and Biden's response, the president, as well as a dysfunction. This is all happening in the backdrop of a Congress that is frozen. How do we understand the statement and perhaps some of the next things? And I think we only have about 1 minute left.
Another elevator ride. I thought the president's speech the other night was the best speech of his presidency. Thought it was. Thought it was so personal and so powerful. But it was Mario Cuomo, I'm not sure if he was governor of New York, once said, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. So now what the administration has to figure out is how to govern in prose. And they're giving the military support, intelligence support, but at some point, what the rabbi and we've all been talking about for the last hour, these issues have to be discussed. What is the smart military response to what has happened? What is perhaps tempting, but like most temptations, ought to be resisted? What would then be the smart follow-up to that? How can we work together so the war doesn't widen, so we get the hostages out at a cost or a price we're willing to pay? We need to move from, if you will, the first orders, again, statements of support, which I thought were appropriate and wonderful. I thought it was a really special moment. But now the administration has to figure out how to work with Israel, because this is going to be a long, tough process. Some really difficult decisions, everything we're talking about here and lots of other things, how to deal with Iran, how to deal with Hezbollah, what should be the limits to Israeli military operations, what comes the day after, and so forth. That, that'll be the real test of the Israeli-U.S. relationship. Are we able to have that kind of what we used to call a strategic dialogue, where we deal with the most important, complex, intimate relations of security. Can the United States and Israel work their way through them? We did it, for example, sorry to go on slow, when the Iraqis were attacking Israel during the Gulf War, we did that. It was an amazing moment, and the United States sat down with Israel, and Israel acted with restraint. Itzhak Shamir, the prime minister, even though Israel was being attacked with Scuds, he decided when we spoke to him about it that Israel would not retaliate directly because there were larger strategic interests at stake, and the Israelis and the Americans were on the same page. That's the sort of conversation we need to have now. How do we stay on the same page as we work ourselves through some extraordinarily difficult decisions where, again, there are no perfect options? This will be a real test for the relationship. But I thought what the president did the other day and with the military help that followed, I feel that he put some money into the U.S.-Israeli account, literally and figuratively. He banked a lot of goodwill. Israelis now know they have a friend here. The stuff going on in Washington isn't helpful, but that was a really good backdrop to what is going to come. So I'll end on a rare note of optimism. I think the United States and Israel are well positioned to manage this, but it's going to demand a lot of both sides.
Dr. Haass, thank you so much for giving an hour of your time.
Thank you.
There is no shortage of opportunity into the week and weeks ahead. It's all on the website. We have touched the mind. In about 10 minutes, we're going to touch a heart. We're going to come together in prayer and community. Take a moment, stretch, do what you need to do, and come back here into the pews in just a few minutes. Thank you, everyone.